The paperwork said Sector 41C. That was the first thing that didn't make sense, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. Our regional office manages sectors 1 through 34. I'd seen the maps. I'd worked in sectors 7, 12, and 19 over my previous 4 years with the service. The numbering convention follows a grid, east to west, north to south. And there is no 41C. There's no 41 anything. I'd have assumed it was a clerical error if it hadn't been printed on every single document in my intake packet, each one signed and stamped by people whose titles I recognized and whose signatures I'd seen on dozens of previous assignments. I remember sitting in the plastic chair across from Supervisory Ranger Elias Marsh in the regional office on a Tuesday afternoon in September. He had a cup of coffee that he never drank from. It sat on his desk the entire meeting, and the surface never rippled, and the steam was gone before I sat down, which means it had been poured well before I arrived. I mention this because he gave the impression of someone who had been waiting for a while and had arranged things carefully, not nervously, not with the fussiness of someone trying to impress, more like someone who had rehearsed. He told me the assignment was a 6-week solo post in a remote sector, fire monitoring and wildlife census, with supplementary duties in trail erosion cataloging. He said the sector was relatively new to the service's jurisdiction and had not been fully integrated into standard mapping systems. He said this without emphasis, the way you'd mention that the Wi-Fi in a new building hadn't been set up yet, administrative delay, bureaucratic gap, nothing worth lingering on. I asked if there were existing reports I could review before heading in, and he said no. He said there had been a previous ranger assigned there, but that the post had been unoccupied for roughly 7 months before my assignment, and that whatever documentation had been generated during the prior tenure had been archived and was not readily accessible. I asked who the previous ranger was, and he paused. Not long, maybe a second, and said the name wasn't relevant and that I'd be starting with a clean baseline, which was actually preferable from a data integrity standpoint. That pause is something I've thought about many times since. He gave me a 3-ring binder with laminated pages. It contained topographic overlays, a supply manifest, emergency radio frequencies, and a behavioral protocol sheet. The protocol sheet was the only part that felt unusual. Most of it was standard: check-in schedule, wildlife encounter procedures, fire response guidelines. But at the bottom, below a section on reporting, there was a short paragraph that read, and I'm paraphrasing from memory because I no longer have the binder, something to the effect of, in the course of duties, personnel may observe environmental features or phenomena that do not correspond with mapped data or expected patterns. Such observations should not be included in official reports. Personnel should use discretion and focus documentation on verifiable, reproducible data. I read it twice. Then I looked at Marsh. He was watching me, and when I looked up, he didn't look away. He said, "That section is there because the sector is under-documented. You'll be working without the usual reference points. It can produce confusion. The instruction is there to keep your reports clean and useful. If something doesn't line up with the map, it's because the map is incomplete. You're not expected to fill in the gaps on this rotation." I nodded. It made sense. At the time, it made sense. He said, "Don't overthink things out there. Do your routes, take your measurements, file your reports. If something seems off, it's probably because you don't have the full context. That's not your fault, and it's not your job to resolve it." I said, "Okay." I signed the last few forms. He shook my hand and told me there would be a supply cache refreshed bi-weekly by a crew that would not make direct contact with me. They'd drop it at a designated point, and I was to retrieve it within 24 hours. "You won't see them," he said. "They come and go early." I drove out the next morning. The access road wasn't on any map I had. Marsh had given me handwritten directions. Turn by turn, reference to mile markers and landmarks, which was itself unusual in the age of GPS. My GPS, in fact, stopped updating about 40 minutes into the drive. The screen showed my position as a static dot on a gray background with no road data, no terrain, no labels. It stayed that way for the rest of the drive, and, I would later learn, for the remainder of my time there. The road was unpaved, but well maintained, which is a detail that stuck with me. If the sector was supposedly underdocumented and administratively neglected, someone was grading that road. The gravel was even. There were no washouts. The drainage ditches on either side were clean. Someone was maintaining this road on a regular schedule. The station was a standard-issue Type 2 patrol cabin. Single room, wood frame, with a porch, a propane stove, a cot, a desk, and a radio setup. It was clean, not abandoned clean, not dusty and swept clean, but clean in the way a place is when someone wiped everything down recently. There was a faint smell of pine cleaner. The mattress on the cot had no stains. The radio was already tuned to the correct frequency. I unpacked, set up my gear, ate a cold dinner from my supplies, and went to bed. The forest outside was quiet, not silent. There was wind and the occasional sound of something moving through the underbrush at a distance, but quiet in the way that forests are when they're very large and there's no human noise for miles. I fell asleep quickly. The first few days were ordinary. I followed the patrol routes indicated on the topographic overlay. There were 4 primary loops, each covering a different quadrant of the sector, and I was expected to complete 1 per day, rotating through them on a 4-day cycle. Each loop was roughly 9 miles. The terrain was mixed. Dense conifer stands, some hardwood groves, a few meadow clearings, 2 creeks, and a ridge that formed the northern boundary. I carried a GPS unit, a compass, a field notebook, a camera, and a radio. The GPS remained non-functional throughout. I relied on the compass and the topo map, which was hand-drawn rather than printed. It was detailed and, as far as I could tell in those early days, accurate. My duties were straightforward. I recorded weather observations at the station every morning. I noted wildlife signs on my patrols. Tracks, scat, feeding marks, calls heard. I checked fire risk indicators, dryness of duff, wind patterns, dead fuel loads. I measured water levels at the 2 creek crossings. I photographed anything that seemed relevant and filed brief reports via the radio each evening during my scheduled check-in. The check-ins were with a dispatcher I never met. She identified herself only as Base, and our exchanges were brief and formulaic. I'd give my position, a summary of observations, and any supply needs. She'd acknowledge and sign off. She never asked follow-up questions. She never made small talk. It was professional, but impersonal in a way that went beyond professionalism. It felt procedural, like she was reading from a script, or like she was only authorized to say certain things. Oh, I settled into the rhythm. That's what happens on solo assignments. The first day or two feels strange, and then the routine takes over, and the solitude becomes a kind of texture. You stop noticing, the way you stop hearing a refrigerator hum after living in a house long enough. I woke early, made coffee, recorded weather, packed my kit, walked my loop, ate lunch on the trail, finished the loop, returned to the cabin, Organized my notes, made dinner, did the radio check-in, read or sat on the porch, went to bed. Days 3 through 5 were indistinguishable from one another. That was fine. That was normal. On day 6, I was walking Loop C, the southern quadrant, when I came to a section of the trail that passed through a grove of white birch. The birch grove was notable because it was the only one in the sector. Everything else was Douglas fir and western red cedar with pockets of alder. I'd passed through it on day 2 and made a note. Birch grove, approximately 40 trees, good health, no sign of disease or pest damage. I had photographed it. On day 6, the grove was larger. Not dramatically, not in a way that would be impossible. But the cluster of birch that I had estimated at roughly 40 trees now seemed to extend further to the east than I remembered. I stood at what I believed was the same spot where I'd taken the photograph on day 2 and looked at it. There were more trees, maybe 50, maybe 55. The spacing was different. The canopy was a little denser. I told myself I'd misjudged on the first pass. It's easy to miscount trees in a grove. Your eye groups them, and you estimate, and estimation is imprecise. I was working without reliable GPS, without aerial imagery, without any of the tools that would normally anchor my spatial memory. I adjusted my notes. Birch grove, approximately 50 to 55 trees, and moved on. On day 10, the grove was back to roughly 40 trees. I stood there for a long time that afternoon. I counted twice, 38, then 41, depending on whether I included a few saplings at the margin. The eastern extension I'd noticed on day 6 wasn't there. The grove ended where it had ended on my first visit. The canopy was thinner. I did not adjust my notes. I wrote nothing about it. I remembered the protocol sheet. Observations that do not correspond with mapped data or expected patterns should not be included in official reports. And I remembered marsh. If something doesn't line up, it's because the map is incomplete. You're not expected to fill in the gaps. But this wasn't a gap in the map. This was a gap in what I'd seen with my own eyes on 2 separate occasions in the same location. I thought about it that evening in the cabin. The rational explanations came easily. Fatigue, imprecise first impression, seasonal changes in foliage creating an illusion of density, different light conditions. Day 2 had been overcast. Day 6 had been bright. Day 10 was overcast again. Light changes how you perceive depth and distance in a forest. Any experienced ranger knows this. You learn early that the woods look different every time you walk through them, even when nothing has changed. I accepted this. I moved on. Day 12. I was on Loop A, the northern quadrant, walking the ridgeline that served as the sector boundary. The ridge was distinctive because it had a series of exposed rock formations along the crest, granite outcroppings weathered into irregular shapes. On my first traverse of Loop A on day 1, I'd noted 3 significant outcroppings visible from the trail. I had not photographed them, but I'd described them in my notebook. 3 granite outcroppings, largest approximately 12 feet high, spaced roughly 200 meters apart along the ridgeline. On day 12, there were 4 outcroppings. The 4th was between the 2nd and 3rd, roughly where I would have said there was only a gap on day 1. It was not small. It was perhaps 8 feet tall and 15 feet wide, lichen-covered, clearly not recent. Granite doesn't appear in 11 days. It doesn't appear in 11 centuries. It was either there on day 1 and I somehow walked past it without noticing, or it wasn't. I stood looking at it for a while. I touched it. It was real. It was solid. It was cold under my palm. the way rock is when it's been in shade. Lichen grew in the crevices. There was moss at the base. A chipmunk ran across the top while I was standing there and disappeared into a crack. I did not write it down. That evening, during my radio check-in, I gave my standard report. Weather, wildlife, trail conditions. I said nothing about the outcropping. The dispatcher. Base. Acknowledged and signed off. I sat at the desk afterward and looked at the wall. The cabin had no decoration, no photographs, no calendar, just bare wood. I looked at it for a long time. I want to be clear about something. I was not frightened at this point. I was confused, and I was aware that my confusion was producing a low-level discomfort, but I was not afraid. Confusion is normal in fieldwork. You see things that don't add up, and usually the explanation is mundane. You were wrong the first time, or you're wrong now, or there's a variable you haven't accounted for. Fear comes later. Fear comes when the explanations stop being satisfying, and you're left with the raw discrepancy, and you have to decide what to do with it. I wasn't there yet, not on day 12. The supply cache was dropped on day 14, as scheduled. I walked to the designated point, a clearing about a mile north of the cabin, and found a standard resupply crate, non-perishable food, water purification tablets, batteries, a new propane canister, and a sealed envelope. I'd received supplies before on other assignments, and there was never an envelope. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. Continue current protocol. No changes to assignment parameters. Report any equipment malfunctions. It was unsigned. There was no letterhead. Just those 3 sentences. I put it in my pack and carried the supplies back. That night, I tried to raise base outside my scheduled check-in time. The radio produced only static. I tried for about 20 minutes, cycling through adjacent frequencies, then gave up. During the scheduled check-in at 2000 hours, the dispatcher was there as always, and the exchange was normal. I did not mention the envelope. I'm not sure why. Something about it felt like it wasn't meant to be discussed, like it was a communication that existed only between the sender and me, and acknowledging it to a third party would violate a boundary I couldn't articulate. That feeling of boundaries I couldn't articulate became more prominent as the days went on. Day 16. Loop B, the eastern quadrant. There was a creek crossing on this loop, a shallow ford over a stream maybe 10 feet wide. I'd crossed it 7 times by that point, 4 on scheduled patrols, 3 on supplementary walks. The stream flowed south to north. I knew this because I'd observed the current, noted the direction of debris accumulation on the rocks, and confirmed it with my compass the first time I crossed it. Water flowed south to north. On day 16, it flowed north to south. The current was gentle but visible, and the debris patterns on the rocks were reversed, buildup on the south-facing sides instead of the north. I crouched at the bank and watched it for several minutes. I put my hand in. The water moved against my fingers from the north, pushing south. I checked my compass. North was still north. The stream was flowing the other direction. I crossed it and continued my patrol. On the far side, I stopped and looked back. The water was flowing south to north again. I watched it. I walked back to the bank. South to north. Normal. I crossed again. I looked back from the other side. South to north. I finished the loop. That night, I sat on the porch and did not read, did not eat dinner, did not do anything except sit. The forest was doing its usual evening sounds. Birds settling, insects starting, the occasional crack of a branch somewhere far off that could be a deer or an elk, or just a dead limb finally giving way. I sat there until it was fully dark, and then went inside and lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling. I was beginning to feel something that I can only describe as a specific kind of tiredness, not physical fatigue. I was in good shape, and the loops were demanding but manageable. This was cognitive. It was the tiredness of holding two incompatible pieces of information in your mind at the same time and trying to reconcile them. The stream flows south to north. The stream flows north to south. Both of these things are true because I observed both of them. Both of these things cannot be true because a stream does not reverse its flow and then reverse back within the span of 5 minutes. But I had been told, explicitly and clearly, not to question certain things. I had been told that the map was incomplete and that inconsistencies were expected. I had been told that my job was to record verifiable, reproducible data, not to investigate anomalies. And if I allowed myself to sit with that instruction, really sit with it, it was almost comforting. It meant that my confusion was anticipated. Someone knew this would happen. Someone had prepared for it. The protocol paragraph, Marsh's careful words, the unsigned note in the supply cache. These were all, in a sense, acknowledgments that I would experience exactly what I was experiencing, and that the appropriate response was to continue doing my job and not engage with it. There is a particular kind of relief in being told that your confusion is not your problem to solve. I felt that relief. I leaned into it. I let it carry me through the next several days. Days 17 through 20 were mostly uneventful. I did my loops, took my measurements, filed my reports. The birch grove was at roughly 40 trees each time I passed through it. The 4 outcroppings on the ridge were consistently 4. The stream flowed south to north on every crossing. Things were stable. I began to wonder if I'd imagined the discrepancies, or at least exaggerated them. Memory is unreliable. Perception is context-dependent. I knew this. Anyone who spent significant time alone in a wilderness knows that your mind starts doing things. Not dramatic things, not hallucinations, but small adjustments, little filling in the blanks where your brain supplies what it expects rather than what's actually there. I was in week 3 of a solo assignment with minimal human contact. Some perceptual drift was expected. On day 21, I found the cairn. It was on Loop D, the western quadrant, in a section of dense cedar forest where the canopy was thick enough to block most direct light. The trail here was narrow and soft, carpeted with needles, and it wound between trunks that were 3 and 4 feet in diameter. I'd walked this section 5 times before and never seen a cairn. But there it was, just off the trail to the left, a stack of flat stones about 2 feet high. It was carefully built. The stones were selected for flatness and stacked with attention to balance. It was not a natural formation. Someone had built it. I stopped and looked at it. Then I looked around. The forest was empty, quiet. The light filtered through the canopy in diffuse green-gold patches. Nothing moved. I approached the cairn and examined it without touching it. The stones were local, the same gray granite as the ridge outcroppings. There was no moss on them, no lichen. They were clean. Either they'd been placed recently, or someone had cleaned them. I took a photograph. Then I took 2 more from different angles. Then I stood there and thought about what to do. Cairns in the backcountry are not unusual. Hikers build them. Previous rangers build them. Indigenous peoples built them historically, and some are culturally significant. But this was a sector with no established trails, no public access, and, supposedly, No recent human presence, except for the unknown ranger who'd been here before me and the supply crew that came and went without contact. Someone had built this cairn. It was either the previous ranger, the supply crew, or someone else. I did not report it. I added it to my personal notes, the ones I kept in a separate notebook that was not part of the official documentation, and continued my loop. On day 25, loop D again. The cairn was gone. The spot where it had been was undisturbed. The needle cover was even and unbroken. There was no sign that stones had been stacked there 4 days earlier. No depression, no scattered fragments, no disturbance of any kind. It was as if it had never existed. I checked my personal notebook. The entry was there. Day 21, loop D, cairn, approximately 2 feet, stacked granite, no lichen, off-trail left, cedar section. I checked my camera. The photographs were there. 3 images of a stone cairn in a cedar forest. The cairn was real. I had documented it. And now it was gone, and the ground where it had stood showed no trace. I knelt at the spot and brushed the needles with my hand, undisturbed. The duff layer was intact. If someone had removed the cairn, they had done so with extraordinary care, replacing the ground cover to its exact prior state. Or the cairn had never been there, and my notebook entry and photographs were wrong somehow, which was not possible because I was looking at them. This was the first time I felt something closer to fear. Not the fear of a threat. There was nothing threatening about a missing cairn, but the fear of a world that is not behaving according to rules. The fear of a floor that might not be solid. Every rational explanation I could construct required me to doubt either my current perception or my previous perception, and I had documentation supporting both. The cairn existed. The cairn did not exist. My notes said it did. The ground said it didn't. I went back to the cabin. I did my check-in. I said nothing about it. The dispatcher acknowledged and signed off. I lay on the cot and held my notebook open to the entry about the cairn and read it over and over, as though repetition could anchor it to something real. The second supply drop came on day 28. Same clearing, same type of crate. Food, batteries, water tablets, another sealed envelope. This one contained the same typed message as before. Continue current protocol. No changes to assignment parameters. Report any equipment malfunctions. Word for word, identical. Same plain paper, same typeface. No signature, no letterhead. I stood in the clearing holding the 2 envelopes side by side. Identical. I turned them over. The same. I held them up to the light. The paper was the same weight, the same slight off-white color. Even the fold lines were in the same position. I put them both in my pack. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done before. I deviated from my patrol route. Instead of walking Loop A, which was scheduled for that day, I walked directly north from the cabin, off trail, into a section of forest that was not covered by any of the 4 loops. The topographic overlay showed this area as undifferentiated terrain. No features marked, no contour lines, just a blank space with the label unassigned in small type. I walked for about 2 hours. The forest was the same mixed conifer that characterized most of the sector. The ground rose gradually. I used my compass to maintain a northward bearing. After 2 hours, I estimated I'd covered about 4 miles. I should have been approaching the northern boundary of the sector, the ridge. But the ground was still rising, gently, and there was no ridge in sight. I continued for another hour. No ridge. The forest was uniform and unbroken. The compass still read north. I turned around and walked south. The return trip took approximately 3 hours, which was consistent with the outbound distance. I arrived at the cabin just before dark. The cabin was exactly where it should have been, exactly as I'd left it. Nothing was wrong with it. Nothing was wrong with anything, except that the northern boundary of the sector, which I could see from the ridgeline on Loop A, apparently did not exist when approached from a different direction. I did not report this. I want to talk about the silence because it became important. I don't mean the absence of sound. The forest was never truly silent. There was always wind, always distant bird calls, always the small sounds of organic activity. I mean the silence between me and the rest of the world. My only human contact was the nightly radio check-in, which lasted 90 seconds at most. I had no phone reception, no internet, no way to communicate outside the scheduled window. The supply crew never appeared. The dispatcher never said anything beyond acknowledgments and sign-offs. After about 3 weeks, this silence started to acquire a weight, not a metaphorical weight, a physical one. I could feel it when I woke in the morning, a kind of pressure in the cabin, like the air was denser. It sat on my chest. It filled the spaces between activities. When I finished my patrol and returned to the cabin and sat at the desk to write up my notes, the silence would settle around me like something poured, and I would sit in it and feel it press against me and have the thought, very clearly, no one knows what is happening here except me. And then the corollary, and I am not sure what is happening here. This is the part that's difficult to communicate. The anomalies themselves were not, individually, terrifying. A birch grove that changed size, a stream that briefly reversed, a rock formation that may or may not have appeared, a cairn that was there and then wasn't. Each one, in isolation, had possible explanations. Trees are hard to count. Streams can have eddies that create visual confusion. Memory is imprecise. Cairns can be dismantled by animals or weather. But accumulation does something that individual incidents cannot. Each new discrepancy made the previous ones harder to dismiss. They stacked. They reinforced each other, not as evidence of anything specific. I never had a theory about what was happening, never constructed a narrative of the supernatural or the conspiratorial, but as evidence that my ability to perceive and record reality was compromised in some way. Either the world was inconsistent, or I was. And I didn't know which was worse. Day 30, halfway point. I woke early and lay on the cot and did a kind of mental inventory. I asked myself, "Are you okay?" And the answer was, "I think so. I'm eating. I'm sleeping, mostly. I'm doing my job. My reports are accurate. At least, they're accurate within the parameters I've been given. I'm not hearing voices, not seeing things that aren't there, not losing time. I know what day it is. I know my name. I know where I am." But that last one felt less certain than it should have. I knew the sector. I knew the 4 loops, the cabin, the clearing, the ridgeline. But I didn't know where any of it was in relation to the rest of the world. My GPS didn't work. My map showed only the sector itself, with no surrounding context. The access road I'd driven in on was behind me, somewhere to the south, but I hadn't walked it since arriving, and the thought of walking it produced a faint anxiety that I couldn't explain. As if the road might not be there, or as if it might lead somewhere different. I stayed in the cabin that day. I did not walk a loop. I cleaned my equipment, reorganized my supplies, and reread my field notes from the beginning. They were thorough, professional, and entirely unremarkable. Nothing in them hinted at anything wrong. They described a healthy mixed conifer forest, with normal wildlife activity and no significant fire risk. They described exactly the kind of sector that wouldn't need to be on any map. Unremarkable, unexceptional, barely worth mentioning. And yet someone had assigned a ranger to it, and another ranger before me, and a supply crew came every 2 weeks, and a dispatcher monitored the radio every night. Resources were being allocated to this place. People were paying attention to it, but the instruction was to not pay attention to the things that made it noteworthy. On day 32, I walked Loop C and counted the birch grove again. 43 trees. On day 36, 47. On day 40, 39. I was counting carefully each time now, walking through the grove systematically, touching each trunk. The numbers were never the same twice. The individual trees were never in different positions. I couldn't point to a specific spot and say, there was a tree here last time and now there isn't. The change was always in aggregate, always in the total, as if the grove expanded and contracted in some area just beyond the boundary of my precise attention. I started photographing the grove from the same position each time, using a marked tree as a reference. When I compared the photographs later, they looked identical. Whatever I was perceiving in person did not register on the camera, or the camera was recording the truth, and my perception was recording something else. I didn't know which. On day 34, I had a conversation with the dispatcher that deviated from the script. I was giving my evening check-in, and after the standard exchange, I said, "Base, I have a question." There was a pause. Then, "Go ahead." I said, "How long has this sector been under service jurisdiction?" Another pause, longer this time. Then, "That information is not available at my level. Is there anything else?" I said no. She signed off. The radio went to static. The next evening I tried again. I said, "Base, can you confirm the name of the previous ranger assigned to this sector?" The pause was immediate and heavy. Then, "Personnel records are not accessible through field dispatch. Please restrict check-ins to operational reporting. Is there anything else?" I said no. She signed off. I did not try again after that. The boundary had been communicated clearly. I was to report on the forest and nothing else. My questions about context, history, and the people connected to this place were not welcome. This was not said with hostility. It was said with the measured blankness of someone who is following instructions that they may not fully understand themselves. And that thought, that the dispatcher might also be operating under restrictions, might also be told not to question certain things, was one of the most unsettling I had during the entire assignment. Day 37. I found something in the cabin. I had been there for over 5 weeks. I had opened every drawer, every cabinet. I had moved the cot, swept under the desk, checked the stove compartments. The cabin was small, and I knew every inch of it. But on day 37, I found a small notebook wedged between the back panel of the desk and the wall. It had slipped down into a gap that I hadn't noticed before, or that hadn't been there before, and I only found it because I dropped a pen and it rolled into the crack. The notebook was small, palm-sized, with a black cover. The pages were lined. About a third of them had been written on in handwriting that was not mine. The writing was small and neat and careful. The first entry read, "Day 1, arrived, cabin clean, radio operational, Marsh briefed me. Don't log anomalies, standard assignment otherwise." I read that sentence 3 times. Marsh, the same supervisor, the same instruction. Don't log anomalies. I sat at the desk and read the entire notebook. The entries were sparse, usually just a few lines per day. The author. The previous ranger, presumably described the same sector I was living in. The same 4 loops, the same features, the same duties. The early entries were routine, almost boring. Then, around day 15, they started to change. Day 15. Birch Grove seems larger, counted approximately 60 trees, had it at 40 before, probably miscounted the first time. Day 18. Ridge has 3 outcroppings today. I thought there were 4. Going to check again tomorrow. Day 23. Creek was running the wrong way this morning. Reversed by afternoon. Don't know what to make of this. Day 27. Found a cairn on Loop D. Nobody should be out here. Didn't report it. I stopped reading. My hands were not shaking. I want to be precise about that. My hands were still. My breathing was normal. But there was a sensation in my stomach that I can only compare to the feeling of missing a step on a staircase. That lurch of sudden wrongness, of the world shifting underfoot. The previous ranger had seen the same things, the same birch grove changing size, the same outcroppings changing number, the same stream reversing, the same cairn, the same anomalies in the same places, in roughly the same sequence. I kept reading. Day 30, I'm fine. I think I'm fine. The forest is just confusing. It's big, and I'm alone, and my brain is filling in gaps. Marsh told me this would happen. Not in those words, but he told me. Day 33. Tried to walk to the northern boundary off trail. Never reached the ridge. Walked for 3 hours. No ridge. Came back. Ridge is there on Loop A. I can see it from the trail. I can stand on it. But I can't reach it any other way. Day 38. I counted the birch grove today, 42. Yesterday, 51. I'm not miscounting. I'm being careful. I touch each trunk. The number changes. Day 40. Thinking about whether to mention any of this on the radio. Decided not to. What would I say? The trees keep changing? They'll pull me out and send me for evaluation. And maybe that's the right call. Maybe I need evaluation. But I don't feel unstable. I feel like I'm seeing what's here. Day 42. Cairn is back. Same spot. Same stones. I know it's the same because there's one stone with a quartz vein running through it. I noticed it before it disappeared. It's the same cairn. Day 44. I don't want to be here anymore. That's the truest thing I can write. I don't understand what I'm looking at. And I've been told not to try. I just want to go home and not think about any of this. Day 45. Marsh wouldn't have sent me here without a reason. There's a reason for the assignment and a reason for the instructions. I just don't know what they are. That's the part that's hard, not the anomalies, the not knowing why. The entries stopped on day 45. They were blank pages after that. The previous ranger had 12 days left on a 6-week assignment and stopped writing with 12 days to go. I didn't know what that meant. Maybe they just stopped. Maybe they ran out of things to say. Maybe something happened. Maybe nothing happened. The notebook offered no conclusion, no final entry, no explanation. I put it in my pack with my personal notebook. Then I took it out and put it back in the desk gap. Then I took it out again and held it and looked at it. I put it in my pack. That night, I did my check-in, standard report. I signed off. I sat on the cot and held the previous ranger's notebook and my own side by side and compared the entries. The parallels were not exact, but they were close enough to be disturbing. Close enough to suggest that the sector produced a specific sequence of experiences in the people assigned to it, like a script, like a pattern. The birch grove first, then the outcroppings, then the stream, then the cairn. each one a little harder to dismiss, each one pushing a little further past the boundary of rational explanation. And the instruction. Marsh's instruction, printed on the protocol sheet, reinforced in his office, echoed in the unsigned notes. That instruction was not about keeping reports clean. It was about keeping the ranger manageable. It was about ensuring that the person living in this sector, alone, experiencing things that didn't make sense, would respond not by investigating, not by questioning, not by demanding answers, but by filing it away, suppressing it, continuing the routine. The instruction was a tool for controlling perception. Not what you saw, but what you did with what you saw. I want to be careful here, because I am aware that this line of thinking can sound paranoid, and I don't believe I was paranoid. I was reasoning from evidence. Marsh knew the anomalies would occur. The protocol paragraph made that clear. The previous ranger had experienced the same ones. The instruction was specifically designed to prevent documentation, and the dispatcher was trained to deflect questions about context. This was not an accident. This was not administrative sloppiness. This was a system. But a system designed to do what? I didn't know. I still don't. Days 38 through 42 were the hardest. The anomalies didn't increase in frequency, but my tolerance for absorbing them had eroded. Every patrol felt like a test. I'd approach the birch grove and count. I'd reach the ridge and count the outcroppings. I'd cross the stream and check the current. I was no longer performing my official duties with any real attention. The wildlife census data was perfunctory. The fire risk assessments were copied from previous days with minor variations. My reports were technically adequate but hollow, because my actual attention was consumed by the discrepancies I was not reporting. I began to notice things I hadn't before, or things that hadn't been there before. A tree on Loop B with a blaze mark. A stripe of bark shaved off at eye level that I had not seen in my first 9 passes along that trail. A patch of ground on Loop A where the duff was disturbed in a circular pattern, as if something had been placed there and removed. A sound, heard twice on Loop D, that was like a low, distant tone. Not mechanical, not biological, not wind. Just a tone that lasted about 10 seconds and then stopped. I logged none of it. I had internalized the instruction so thoroughly that the act of not reporting had become automatic. I would notice something wrong, and my mind would immediately categorize it as non-reportable and move on. It was efficient. It was what I'd been asked to do, and it meant that the only complete record of what I experienced existed in my personal notebook, which no one would ever read unless I showed it to them. On day 40, I made a decision that I've since struggled to explain. I walked to the supply clearing at a time when no drop was scheduled. It was mid-morning. The clearing was empty. No crate, no signs of activity. I stood in the center of it and looked at the tree line. The clearing was roughly circular, about 50 meters in diameter, with uniform grass. I'd been there twice before for supply pickups and hadn't thought much about it. Standing there now, I noticed that the clearing was too uniform. The grass was one species. I'm not a botanist, but it was all the same height, the same color, the same density. There were no wildflowers, no weeds, no variation. Natural clearings and forests don't look like this. They're messy, irregular, colonized by whatever can exploit the light gap. This clearing looked maintained. It looked planted. I walked the perimeter. The transition from grass to forest was abrupt. A clean line, no gradual thinning, no shrub layer, just grass and then trees. The trees at the edge were all the same species, all roughly the same diameter, all the same height. I had the sudden, queasy sense that I was standing in something that had been constructed to look like a clearing, rather than something that had formed naturally. I went back to the cabin. I did not return to the clearing. Day 42. I was on Loop C, approaching the birch grove, and I stopped before entering it. I stood at the edge and counted from outside. 44 trees. I walked in. 44 trees. I walked through and out the other side and counted from the far edge. 44 trees. Consistent, normal, good. I turned around and walked back through. 44 trees. Still consistent. I was almost back to my starting point when I noticed a tree that had something on it, a mark at the base of the trunk, partially hidden by undergrowth. I pushed the vegetation aside. It was a small symbol carved into the bark, not deep, not fresh. The edges had started to heal, which meant it had been made months ago at least. It was a simple shape, a circle with a horizontal line through it. I stared at it. Then I checked the adjacent trees. 2 more had the same symbol, same height, same depth, same degree of healing. 3 trees in the grove marked with identical symbols. I photographed all 3. I did not report them, but I wrote in my personal notebook. Same marks, same age. Who made them? I checked the previous ranger's notebook. No mention of symbols or carvings. This bothered me more than it should have. The previous ranger and I had experienced the same anomalies in roughly the same order, but the carvings were new. Either the previous ranger hadn't noticed them, or they hadn't been there during the previous assignment, which meant that either I was seeing something that wasn't real, or something had changed between assignments. Something had been added. By whom? I slept poorly that night. Not because of fear exactly, but because of a recursive thought that I couldn't stop. What if the protocol paragraph, and Marsh's instruction, and the dispatcher's deflections, and the unsigned notes, and the notebook hidden in the desk? What if all of it was part of the same system? What if the notebook was left for me to find? What if it was planted like the cairn, like the carvings, like the clearing? What if the previous ranger's experiences were written not by a real person, but by whoever, whatever, was responsible for the anomalies? And if that was the case, what was real? My own notes, my own memories, my own perceptions? I got up and went outside. It was about 3 a.m. The forest was dark and the sky was clear, and I could see stars through the canopy gaps. The stars were normal. I recognized Orion and the Pleiades. This was reassuring. Whatever was happening in this forest, the sky above it was still the sky I knew. I went back inside. I slept. Day 43. I broke protocol. I deviated from my assigned loop and walked south, toward the access road. I followed my compass bearing and stayed on a direct course. After about 40 minutes, I hit the road. It was there, gravel, well-maintained, exactly as I remembered. I stood on it and felt a relief so intense it was almost nauseating. The road was real. The road went somewhere. I turned east on the road and walked for an hour. Then I turned around and walked back past the point where I'd emerged and continued west for an hour. The road was continuous, consistent, unremarkable. It was just a road. I walked back to the cabin via my compass bearing. The cabin was there. Everything was normal. I went inside and sat at the desk and felt something that I think was the closest I came to crying during the entire assignment, though I didn't actually cry. I just sat there and felt a pressure behind my eyes and in my throat that came and went in waves for about 10 minutes. I think what I was feeling was the accumulated weight of doubt, Not doubt about a specific thing, but a generalized doubt, a doubt about the reliability of my own experience. For 6 weeks, I had been perceiving a world that kept changing on me and being told not to question the changes. I had complied, I had done my job, but compliance has a cost, and the cost is that you start to lose confidence in your own senses because you've been treating their reports as unreliable, as non-reportable, as things to be suppressed. Marsh had not lied to me. He hadn't said the forest was normal. He'd said I might notice inconsistencies and should not document them. He'd framed it as data hygiene. But the effect was different from the framing. The effect was that I stopped trusting myself. And I wonder now whether that was the point. Day 44, the third supply drop, same crate, same contents, same envelope. But this time, the message was different. It read, "Assignment concludes on schedule. Extraction will occur at 0800 on day 43. Return all equipment to the cabin. Leave personal effects. Bring only yourself." I read it several times. Day 43. The assignment was 42 days. The note said day 43, which was yesterday. Today was day 44. Either the note was wrong or I had miscounted. I went to my field notebook and counted every daily entry from day 1, 44 entries. Today was day 44. The note said extraction on day 43. Day 43 was yesterday. I had missed it. But there had been no extraction. No one had come. No vehicle. No radio contact. No sign of anyone at the cabin or the clearing or the road. I tried the radio. Static. I tried at the scheduled check-in time. Static. Base did not respond. I tried again every hour for the rest of the evening. Nothing. I sat with this information. The extraction had been scheduled for a day that had already passed, and I had not been informed in advance. And now the radio was silent. Either the note was a mistake, or it wasn't. And either way, I was still here, and no one was coming, and I couldn't reach anyone. I packed my things. I decided that in the morning, I would walk to the access road and follow it out. The handwritten directions Marsh had given me were in my pack. I would reverse them. I would drive. No, I'd walked in, hadn't I? No, I'd driven. My vehicle was parked at the trailhead, wherever that was. Marsh's directions started from the regional office. I would follow the road until I reached a highway, a town, a phone, anything. I went to bed. I did not sleep well, but I slept. Day 45. I left the cabin at first light. I carried my pack with my personal notebook, the previous ranger's notebook, the 3 envelopes and basic supplies. I left the radio, the field equipment, and the official documentation in the cabin, as the extraction note had instructed. I walked south to the access road. It was there. I turned west, which was the direction I had come from on the first day. I walked. The road was straight and uneventful for about 2 miles. Then it curved north. I didn't remember a curve. Marsh's directions described the road as straight for the first 10 miles. But curves can seem different when you're driving versus walking. I followed it. It continued north for about a mile, then turned west again, then south, then west. After 3 hours of walking, I came to a clearing. A circular clearing, about 50 meters in diameter, with uniform grass and an abrupt tree line. It was the supply clearing. I was back in the sector. I stood there for a very long time. The road had led me in a loop, or I had misread my compass, or the road itself had. I stopped that thought. I stopped it because of the instruction. The instruction that I had been following for 45 days. The instruction that had become a reflex, a habit, a part of my cognitive architecture. Do not question things that don't make sense. But I was done. The assignment was over. The instruction no longer applied. And yet I couldn't stop following it. I couldn't step outside it. The pattern was too deep. The habit of not questioning, of filing discrepancies away, of continuing the routine. It had been practiced so many times that it wasn't a decision anymore. It was automatic. I walked back to the cabin. I sat on the porch. The forest was calm. The birds were singing. A light wind moved through the canopy. At 2,000 hours, I tried the radio. This time, Base answered. "This is Base. Go ahead." I gave my standard report. Weather, wildlife, trail conditions, everything normal, no anomalies. "Copy. Extraction rescheduled. New date will be communicated. Continue current protocol." I said, "Copy." She signed off. The radio went to static. I sat at the desk. I opened my personal notebook and the previous ranger's notebook side by side. I turned to the last entry the previous ranger had written on day 45. "Marsh wouldn't have sent me here without a reason. There's a reason for the assignment and a reason for the instructions. I just don't know what they are." I turned to my own notebook. Day 45. I had not written anything yet. I picked up my pen. I wrote, "Marsh wouldn't have sent me here without a reason." I stopped writing. I looked at what I'd written and then at the previous ranger's entry. The same words, the same thought, arriving at the same point in the sequence, as if it were a line in a script that the sector produced in whoever lived in it. I closed both notebooks. I went to bed. I want to describe the days that followed, but they're difficult to distinguish from each other. This is not because nothing happened. Things continued to happen, the same kinds of things, but because my ability to experience them as distinct events had degraded. The birch grove changed. The outcroppings changed. The stream did what it did. The cairn appeared and disappeared. I counted and measured and observed, and none of it stabilized, and none of it matched my previous observations. And I stopped recording it even in my personal notebook, because the act of writing it down had started to feel like building on sand. I did my loops. I filed my reports. The reports were fictions. Clean, professional fictions that described a stable, normal forest that bore no resemblance to what I was experiencing. But they were the reports I'd been asked to generate. They were verifiable and reproducible in the sense that they described what the forest should have been, based on the topographic overlay, and the overlay was the only reference point I'd been given. I was not reporting what I saw. I was reporting what the map said I should see. And here's the thing that I keep coming back to. The thing that makes the entire experience sit in my mind like a stone that won't dissolve. I don't know when I started doing that. I don't know when my report shifted from describing reality to describing the map. It wasn't a conscious decision. It happened gradually over days, over weeks, as each anomaly was suppressed and each discrepancy was filed under non-reportable. At some point, the map became more real to me than the forest. The map was consistent. The map didn't change. The map was the authorized version of reality, and my job was to confirm it. The extraction came on what I believe was day 52, but I'm not certain because I had lost confidence in my count. I woke to the sound of a vehicle on the access road. I went outside and there was a truck. Standard service vehicle, green, with the Shield logo on the door. A man got out. I didn't recognize him. He was wearing a service uniform and had a clipboard. He said, "Ready to go?" I said yes. I got my pack. He drove. The road went south and west and reached a highway in about 90 minutes, And then we were in a town, and then we were at the regional office, and the world was normal and populated and noisy in the way that the world is when you haven't heard another human voice in person for nearly 2 months. Marsh was not in the office. A different supervisor processed my return. She was friendly, efficient, and asked no questions about my experience. She collected my pack, my notebooks. I had moved the previous ranger's notebook to my jacket pocket before arriving, so she didn't get that. And my equipment. She gave me leave paperwork and told me to take 2 weeks off. I went home. I slept for 14 hours. Over the following days, I tried to process what had happened. I reread the previous ranger's notebook many times. I thought about the anomalies, the instruction, the supply notes, the dispatcher, the road that led me in a circle. I thought about Marsh's pause when I asked about the previous ranger. I thought about the protocol paragraph and its careful, bureaucratic language. I thought about calling the regional office and asking to speak to Marsh. I picked up the phone twice and put it down. I wasn't sure what I would ask. The questions I wanted to ask were the questions I'd been told not to ask. And even now, weeks later, in my own home with the phone in my hand, the instructions still had force. It still shaped my thinking. It still made the act of questioning feel like a transgression. Eventually, I went back to work. I was assigned to Sector 12, a standard post, mapped and documented and normal. The trees stayed where they were. The streams flowed in one direction. My GPS worked. My reports described what I saw, and what I saw was what the map said should be there. One afternoon, about 3 weeks into the new assignment, I ran into a ranger named Collins at the district supply depot. We'd overlapped briefly on a training course years ago. He was friendly in the way that rangers are. Quiet, practical, comfortable with silence. We talked about weather and fire season and nothing important. Then he said, "You were at 41C, right?" I looked at him. He said, "I was there 3 years ago." I didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. We stood there in the supply depot with the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and said nothing for what felt like a very long time. Then he said, "Marsh told you about the reports?" I said, "Yes." He nodded. He looked at the wall behind me. He said, "I still think about the birch grove." I said, "How many trees?" He said, "It depends on the day." Then he picked up his supply box and said, "See you around," and walked out. I stood there for a while after he left. Then I went back to my assignment and did my patrol and filed my report and went to bed and lay in the dark and thought about the birch grove and the cairn and the stream and the ridge and the clearing and the road and the notebook and the instruction and the silence. I thought about Marsh sitting in his office with his cold coffee, waiting for me, knowing what he was sending me into, knowing that I would experience exactly what the previous ranger experienced, and the one before that, and the one before that. Knowing that the instruction would keep me quiet. Knowing that the anomalies would erode my confidence in my own senses. Knowing all of this and saying nothing except, "Don't question certain things." I wonder sometimes what would happen if I had questioned them. If I had broken protocol, documented everything, shown it to someone, demanded an investigation. Would anything have changed? Would the birch grove have stabilized? Would the ridge have held still? Would the road have led me out instead of back? Or would the anomalies have simply continued, indifferent to my attention? And the only difference would have been that I'd be the person who made a fuss, who couldn't follow instructions, who saw things that weren't in the report and insisted they mattered. I don't know. I don't think I'll ever know. What I know is this: there is a sector of forest that is not on any map, where the trees change number and the rocks appear and disappear and the water runs backward. And there is a system in place to send people there, one at a time, with instructions that ensure they will see these things and say nothing about them. And the system works. It works because the instruction is simple and reasonable and framed as professionalism, and because by the time you realize what it's really doing to you, you've already been doing it for weeks and you can't stop. I still have the previous ranger's notebook. I keep it in a drawer in my kitchen. Sometimes I take it out and read the last entry. Marsh wouldn't have sent me here without a reason. I wrote the same thing. Collins probably wrote the same thing. Whoever comes after me will probably write it too. And the reason, well, if there is one, remains something we were told not to question. I have not been back to 41C. I have not been asked to go back. But I notice things now that I didn't before. Small things. The way the trees at the edge of my current sector sometimes seem to be in slightly different positions at the end of a patrol than they were at the beginning. The way a familiar trail can feel for just a moment like somewhere I've never been. The way the silence between the sounds can suddenly seem very heavy. I notice these things, and I do what I was trained to do. I don't write them down.